past 5 months, I've been doing a lot of work on these Bosch fuel injection systems on these old Mercedes-Benzes, both the D-jetronic and the K-jetronic. And it's become very obvious to me, fuel pressure testing is one of the most important things you need to do when diagnosing problems with these systems, particularly on the D-jetronic. I mean, it has to be exactly on the money, or your engine's going to run too rich or it's going to run too lean. So look at here, I've been putting together some nice testers that I can offer my customers for the D-jetronic. It's really important to do a fuel pressure test on your engine, but what if the gauge is not accurate? If they're saying that you don't want to be more than 0.1 bar off when testing a D-jetronic fuel injection system, I can't believe how many of these gauges get sold all over the world and probably nobody ever suspects that the gauge may be off. You know, as quality control worldwide has deteriorated over the last 10 years or so, Jerson and I end up having to test a lot of things that we purchase from other vendors. We have to open the boxes, check them for damage, test them to make sure they're accurate. And we got together and we said, well, why don't we test these gauges? And maybe we can figure out a way to recalibrate them if they're off. And sure enough, we took one of our pressure tanks, modified it to put in 2 gauges so we have redundancy, and then we proceeded to see how they would match right here to these gauges. It was surprising. There were a couple that were so far off we were not able to fix them, we were not able to recalibrate them, but most of the gauges were 2 to 4 psi off, and that's just not acceptable for a fuel injection pressure tester. So this is how we did it. We hooked these up this tank and we pump them up, and then we would say, okay, we're so many pounds off. Then we'd have to open up the gauge and recalibrate it and then test it again. So it's a lot of work. But at least we know now that we have a fuel pressure gauge that's accurate. You know, at first I said, hey, well, Jerson, why don't I just go buy some real expensive gauges? And maybe that'll be the solution. And so I went and bought this Bosch tester. It's actually labeled and packaged as a Bosch part. I don't know if it's made by Bosch, but I couldn't believe it. I put this on our tester. This was reading 4 psi high. Most of the other ones were reading a little low. So I think our only solution for this is I can't even trust expensive gauges. I'm going to have to get the gauges that I feel are reliable and recalibrate each one, and that's what we're doing. So now I'm going to let you see this in action. Okay, that's 15. This is reading 12. I think you can see why I'm not going to take it up to 30 for you. Okay, we'll lock this in. I've got that at 22. This one's reading 22. And look what that's reading. You got to be kidding me, 18. 4 psi off. I have to admit, it's quite discouraging when you consider how much time we spend around here at the shop testing everything that we get from other suppliers and manufacturers. I can't imagine there's anybody else out there testing all their pressure testers before they ship them out. Here's a typical D-jetronic V8 from the early 1970s installed in a Mercedes-Benz. And you can see the electronic fuel injectors here, and then you have fuel that actually loops on this rail supplying fuel to these injectors. The old ECU, all it does is time the opening and closing of these fuel injectors here. It's a combination of fuel pressure and this unit here which sets how much fuel is delivered when the fuel injector is open and closed. So if you don't have exactly 30 psi plus or minus 1 psi, then your engine's not going to run right. Can you believe that? So I think everybody with a D-jetronic engine needs to be testing their fuel pressure probably once a year when they do their annual maintenance. And it's very easy to do it. You know, I've got a video on how to depressurize the system, how to hook up the gauge right here at the cold start and just run the engine. Only takes a few minutes. I've got my old 300 SEL outside messing around with fuel pressure on this D-jet engine, and I was able to adjust it to get it to right at 2.1 bar for 30 psi.
Well, that's good.
And then I've let it sit for already 15 minutes. And this is a really good test. Anytime you're checking fuel pressure on your engine, you want to shut it off and then watch the gauge and see what happens over the next hour. This isn't going to hold pressure overnight, but it shouldn't leak down. If it leaks down in 15 minutes, down to 10 or 15 psi, you probably have leaking fuel injectors, or you could have a bad seat inside this pressure regulator that's leaking fuel back to the tank. So this is a really good sign on this engine. And so what I've done is I've come up with a depressurization kit, which you can depressurize the system very quickly. You can attach this gauge. We've calibrated the gauges here to make sure they're very accurate. And I'm offering this as a kit because the accuracy of fuel pressure in a D-jet engine could be even more critical than any other fuel-injected engine out there. If you studied some of the earlier pictures of these gauges on the bench, you may have noticed I made another modification. Originally, I had included this quick disconnect. And I thought, well, that's cool. They just have a quick disconnect here. You can hook this up to the rail and then bring the gauge over and hook this up. And the more I played around with this, the more I said, this isn't a good idea. In fact, I had one of the testers that I was testing actually show a little leak here, and I thought, that's just a problem waiting to happen. You don't need a quick disconnect. And so now I have the fitting directly attached to the hose. The only potential for leak here, and we test these, is this has to pass the pressure test. I like this particular gauge because it has the pressure release. So when you're done testing, you put this in a bottle and hit this valve and it releases pressure from the system, and then you can go ahead and remove the gauge. So this here is the final product that I'm going to be offering. I will include video instructions on how to properly hook this up and get the readings you need for the D-jetronic. And for a limited time, I'm going to include my depressurization kit. Now this kit will allow you to depressurize the D-jetronic fuel system without having to go back and disconnect the fuel pump, without having to pull a fuse, without having to pull a relay. You can quickly depressurize the system with this, and you can hook this up quickly. In fact, you can actually go through the process if you're just doing a pressure test, not changing any hoses. You can actually use this to go ahead and attach this directly without even having to depressurize. So it's just a matter of a few minutes. You can have this tester hooked up to your engine in less than 5 minutes. So I hope you learned a couple things from this video. Number one, do not trust an over-the-counter purchased pressure tester. Okay, I don't care how expensive it is. Number two, I think you learned the importance of using this tester to test the pressure in a D-jetronic fuel injection system. Because if you're not willing to do that, you may have an engine that's running way too lean or way too rich. So we pride ourselves in being able to supply you with a gauge that is known accurate.